Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing this new collaborative album between Czarface and Ghostface Killah, Czarface meets Ghostface. Now this album comes a little less than a year after the last Czarface album, which was actually a collaborative project between them and MF Doom. I thought the album overall was pretty decent. It wasn't one of the best works from either artist, but for what it was a pretty solid collaborative effort. And coming into this new album here, I was hoping to get something similar, if not maybe even better than that last collaborative project. This album definitely could be as good as that last album, or really the best material that any of the artists involved in this project have put out before in the past. However, actually listening to this album ended up underwhelming me a fair bit. I don't think this is a bad album necessarily. I just feel like it's a very underwhelming one, and it's one that consistently feels like it's underperforming for me. There's lots of good or decent ideas spread across this thing, but there's rarely any great ones. So much of this album just feels like it's just there in the background when I'm listening to it. So little about this project really jumps out at me and wants me to really pay attention to it all that much, because so much of what this album is doing just feels tired at this point. The rapping across this project is pretty consistently good. It is probably one of the strongest points about this album through and through. The rapping across it in terms of the flows and all of that is pretty solid overall. The lyrics can be a bit hit or miss at times on this thing. For the most part, I would say they're just really uninteresting all the way through, I guess. Like, they're not terrible, but at the same time, they're not really quotable or exciting or interesting or funny, or really anything that really grabs my attention all that much. There are some exceptions to this, however. Occasionally you will get some great funny or quotable or just really interesting lines across this thing. One of my favorites was, I like you as a person, but as an MC you could turn to dust when I snap like half the MCU. I thought that was pretty clever, but at the same time then you get some, occasionally really bad lyrics thrown in there as well. Take, for example, one that really stood out to me was, yo, the flow more tight than a kid's mind on Fortnite. I don't know what to do with lines like that. I don't know how those two batches of lyrics could exist on the same album, but it just makes listening to this thing, in terms of the lyrics at least, a very inconsistent experience. For the most part, though, it's just pretty uninteresting and just kind of there. And while I feel like the actual rapping on this thing is pretty solid overall, as I've already said, I just feel like the performances themselves aren't the most energetic or exciting or just interesting. I mean, compare the performances on this album to like Every Hero Needs a Villain, for example, or even that last collaborative album with MF Doom, and they're just nowhere near as energetic or exciting. Which, given the very comic book focused aesthetic of this project and Czarface in general, I kind of expect the music itself to reflect the really zany and crazy and flashy style that you oftentimes see on the cover arts for their projects, and that you would expect to see in anything that's related to superheroes and comics. That doesn't really translate into the music on this album, though. It just feels really lifeless. I will say the opening few tracks to this album, Face Off, Iron Claw, and Zarcade 87, are probably three of the best tracks on the album. The fact that they come back to back to back right towards the beginning of this thing makes for a pretty decent opening to the album overall. It's definitely one that, at least compared to the rest of the songs on this project, grabs my attention somewhat and gets me a bit interested in what the rest of this project is going to offer. I just wish that the album kept the same consistency or tried to get better going forward, and it really doesn't do that. I should mention that the production across this album is another point that just feels consistently alright. Like, it's not great, but at the same time it's not terrible for the most part either. For the most part, a lot of the production here is just kind of there, and like a lot of the performances across this thing in terms of the rapping, it's nowhere near as, just a comic book feeling, as crazy and electrifying as it was on an album like Every Hero Needs a Villain, for example. It just doesn't feel like it matches up very nicely with the whole aesthetic of this group as nicely as it should. It just kind of feels like typical, more modern boom bap. The track Morning Ritual that comes about towards the middle of this album is one of the more interesting cuts on the album, I feel. It starts off with some production parts that feel a bit poppier before transitioning into this very dark sounding beat that I thought was pretty good overall. I will say that the performances across this track in terms of the rapping are also pretty solid, but the lyrics can be a bit hit or miss, as I've already described before. And moving away from this track as well, another track that I thought was kind of interesting, but maybe not for the right reasons necessarily, was The King Heard Voices. A lot of the performances across this track from the rappers involved here and the production are pretty decent overall. However, I'm not a really big fan of the feature on this track. This album only features a couple of features spread across it, none from any other rappers, which, given the fact that this is a collaborative project between several rappers, isn't necessarily all that bad of a thing. But just the singing features on this thing alone don't really provide all that much to break up the different portions of this album that just feel a bit, similar to one another. Kendra Morris is the one providing these sung features on this thing. Not familiar with any of her work really, but her feature on this one track in particular, I apologize for getting sidetracked there, is probably my least favorite feature on this entire project. Pretty much, I know there's not a lot, but I really did not like what she did with the chorus here. It feels very eerie and almost a bit cryptic as well, but at the same time it feels a bit over the top too, and it just doesn't match up very nicely with the performances that the rappers are giving on the track and what the production is doing. It just feels like when the chorus hits on this track, I'm being sucked out of everything else that's going on in the album into something that sounds completely different, but not in a good way really. Just it sounds out of place, and I don't really like it all that much. The track also features this beat switch towards the end of the track. Like, it comes so late in the song and like so after everything else that it just feels kind of unessential, and just kind of feels like they're tacking on seconds to this album to extend the album's runtime. And this album overall isn't a super long album by any means. It doesn't even reach 40 minutes in length, so it's a pretty short listen. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, considering I tend to like shorter albums, but on this album there's just several moments where I feel like there's not enough substance to it to really, be an album overall. I feel like there needs to be a bit more done with this in order to make it a fully satisfying project, because too much of this album just feels like it's kind of there at the end of the day. I listen to it, it doesn't sound, like a pain to listen to or anything. It's not unpleasant to listen to, but at the same time it doesn't really stand out to me or interest me all that much. It just kind of becomes background music when I'm listening to it, because all the performances on this thing, the production, all of it just sounds really uninterested with itself. And if it's uninterested with itself, I really don't see much of a reason why I should be interested in it. So overall, this isn't a terrible album or anything like that, but it's one that definitely I feel like is lacking in more places than it should. Too many of the performances on this thing just aren't all that interesting. Too many of the production choices here just aren't all that interesting either. The features aren't really all that exciting, and just all the energy and excitement that I feel like you should be getting on an album like this is pretty much non-existent for the most part. There are a few tracks spread across this thing that I think are alright, but for the most part, even the best tracks on this thing aren't really worth checking out unless you happen to be really into this, either the artist involved with this project pretty much, because I feel like both of them have better tracks that they've released in other projects that are definitely worth checking out before you check out even the best of what you can find on this album. So yeah, I would mostly recommend this album to fans of either the artist involved with this thing. If you happen to like the sound that they do, the whole comic book aesthetic, then I think you'll like this album at least to some extent. But if you're not really into that sound, this album probably isn't going to change your mind, because like I said, it's definitely not the best that you can find in that style. But yeah, that is just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree with it, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. I typically do album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. So if you enjoy that kind of stuff, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.